Got it. Hey, good evening. Yes. Security, okay. Okay. The Waterman restoration effort has now gone on for 12 years running and will continue. But we are right now reaching a point where we are going public. And so as we transition from a very little known work site to a very publicly known restoration interpretive and educational site, we'd like to take stock of what's been done so far and the progress that's been made, because there really is a lot of learning points, take-home points from the mistakes that we've made and some of the successes that we've had. This picture was taken in 2006, and it was taken on a patch of buffelgrass at the time, as Susie mentioned, was known locally as the mother of all buffelgrass patches. That's when we were involved in the Iraq war, and everything was the mother of this and the mother of that. And basically, this was an 18-acre monoculture of buffelgrass following blading, fairly indiscriminate blading done by a BLM mining claimant in earlier years. That was in 2006. And today, it's now a restored and well on its way to being restored saguaro Palo Verde upland landscape. And that all happened in 12 years, and it's still going on. So how did all this happen? Going from a monoculture of buffelgrass to restored saguaro desert? Well, lots of things. And we will highlight a couple of the important things that come to mind. First of all, this badly disturbed piece of land was not only infested with buffelgrass, it was highly eroded because it's on a slope and there was no effort whatsoever to pay attention to the contours. So the first thing that was in order is that since we had the means available through BLM, we needed to contour the land. And the first thing in terms of plant restoration was to establish woody plants, trees, desert plants, because the rule of thumb is unless you establish those woody plants early, you'll never succeed in doing it later. They've got to get established and get growing first off. And so that's what we did. BLM agreed in 2010 to bring in their heavy equipment and contour the land if Arizona Native Plant Society would lead the native plant restoration of that land. Now keep in mind that the land started out as a buffelgrass monoculture. BLM came in with their heavy equipment, D4 cats, pulling rippers, and they basically ripped 18 acres along the contour from the top to the bottom, and it took them an entire week. And it left basically furrows that looked like a plowed field. So we went out, and fortunately at that time of the year, in June, July, you have a seed ripening of the Foothills, Palo Verde, and the ironwood. And fortunately for us, those were growing along 3 miles of Avra Valley Road right outside the restoration site. And so we went out with teams of volunteers and used high-tech technology of sticks and tarps and harvested the trees and caught the tree pods and collected them in big 40-gallon garbage containers. And then we proceeded to plant by seed ironwood, Palo Verde, and Whitethorn Acacia. we totally underestimated the effort it would take. Here in the bottom right, let's see, here in the bottom left is Gay Gilbert bending over planting. You notice, you recognize yourself with the hat there? And that was up towards the top of the Waterman site. But it took us well over a month of persistent planting. We would drop 3 pods, cover it with dirt, 3 pods, cover it with dirt, walk about 2 steps, and we planted the whole thing from top to bottom. And that year we were quite lucky because the rains fell and we did get a pretty good emergence. But we never watered the plants, the trees. We basically, they were on their own. It was tough luck, love. And so all of the trees that we have out there came from rain-fed moisture. So over the years, we've had attrition of the trees, and we've had problem areas where we've had to go back and replant. And so every year we've gone back and harvested the seed, and every year we have replanted in problem areas. So if you go out there today, you'll find over 2,000 trees. We've inventoried them. They are in size all the way from 1 inch high to 12 feet high. We have plants out there that were planted in 2010, always watered by rain, that are now 12 feet high. It's pretty amazing, but it just depends, you know, where their roots are. You can't see, but some of them are lucky and they've got plenty of moisture. So these are young ironwood on the left and Foothills Palo Verde on the right that had emerged already a month after they were planted in 2010. And of course, after the land was opened up by ripping and the rains began to fall in July, by the beginning of August, the whole 18 acres looked like a golf course emerging in buffelgrass. And so we had to do something about that. And we did. And volunteers with backpack sprayers, and our mantra was spray the bad guys, leave the good guys. And we had teams of 3 to 5 guys 3 times a week from the first week of August to the middle of October that year, constantly spraying the bad guys, leaving the good guys. And this persisted over 12 years now. We continue to fight buffelgrass, but a lot less of it. By the second year, we see rice here pointing out a rice lindley on the upper right there pointing out a tortoise. But look at all the buffelgrass around him. He's got live young plants and dead plants that were sprayed the year before. This stuff just came up and it was very, very persistent. But we had to fight back, and our objective was to try to spray those plants before they could go to seed. And brittle bush came up, and it was a blessing because we had good coverage, vegetative coverage, but brittle bush also hides buffelgrass. And so we would spray and spray and spray, but no matter how much we sprayed, there would always be what we called escaped convicts that would go to seed inside the brittle bush plants, and then the whole cycle would start over again. This picture is buffelgrass coming up this year in the month of August. So just to say that even after 12 years, the stuff is still here. And so the take-home message here is that we have a buffelgrass problem, but if you're going to treat buffelgrass in an area, you're there for good. And even if you treat it for 12 years, you're still going to have stewardship of the land to go after it and keep the populations down. This is a very important message, and that is people are very concerned about the herbicide the pesticide that's being spread on the land, and the amount that's being spread around. But the fact of the matter is, the first year, with all of the spraying that we had to do, we laid down 234 gallons of herbicide. That's a lot on 18 acres. But we had killed so many of the plants that the second year we sprayed every buffelgrass we could find, and we only laid down 74. The third year, 45. The fourth year, 10. And since then, it's between 3 and 5 gallons a year. And so basically, if you go after it and you keep after it and you have timely applications, your big amount of kill is the first 3 years. And after that, you get it down and you get it in control, and your native plants start to take over. But afterwards, you still have to go out and you have to spot spray. And it's something that we just have to live with. The next issue we had was keeping rainwater on the site. When the plants were still small and the trees were still small, and if we had a 1-inch rain and we were on a slope, we got runoff. And unless we did something, we would end up with gullies that would cut deep and take all of the rainwater off the site and just evaporate out in the desert. So we had to do something about keeping the water on the site itself until we had plant establishment. And so we used 3 techniques, and we'll look at them. And the first was, we made use of rocks. And this was used by local native indigenous people back in the 900s, 1000s, 1100s here in Tucson. And basically, where you have water flowing down a water course, you put in rocks across to slow down the water. And these are called one-rock dams. And basically, it's one rock because it's only one rock thick. You don't put one rock on top of another, but you have one rock after another. And as the water runs down, it slows the water down, and the rocks slow the water down and spreads the water out. And what does that do? It provides moisture for plants to grow. And we have about 180 structures like this on the site today. And because of that, up until recently, we have not had any major down cuts, and all of the water has been kept on the site itself. On the habitation site of the mining claimant, he had packed gravel, and in spite of all the work of BLM rippers, that packed gravel made it impossible for plants to emerge. And so we came up with the idea of using backhoe work, where the backhoe would go in and pull up a shovel of gravel and move 2 feet and put it down. Pick up a shovel, move 2 feet and put it down. And what does it do? It leaves dimples. We call these water retention dimples. And so when it rains, it retains the water and the moisture. And on the left, these are the dimples that were following the work of the backhoe. These just look like hills of gravel. And this is 2 years later. And look at the coverage of the brittle bush and the native grasses and the trees. It's quite remarkable. And on our tours that we've been having out at the Waterman site, people are able to see areas where we did this work compared to where it wasn't done, and it's quite amazing. Tree branch mulch. Of the 3 techniques, one-rock dams, dimples, tree branch mulch is probably the most surprising of all. And this is where we simply brought in tree branches. We were careful not to bring tree branches with seeds of bottle brush or, oleander. But but basically we brought in tree branches from the city, and we had drag parties, and we would drag them out to the bare areas in the site, and the tree branches themselves would deteriorate and rot over a period of about 5 years. And as they did that, they provide shade and they provide mulch. And even with a small rain, plants would start to grow underneath them. And if you come out to the Waterman site, we'll show you today that tree branches on bare areas, tree branches that have been there for 5 years, look at all the plant growth underneath them compared to the areas without the tree branches. It's quite remarkable. Here you see an area where branches were brought, and we have Mexican Panicgrass and Allionia in Canaan trailing 4 o'clock coming up, and we'll talk about those in a second. And now we have the return of the natives. We now have 108 native species and counting. We resisted all temptations to plant seed mixes, because when you plant seed mixes that are native seed mixes, you always bring in species that you don't mean to bring in. And those species do well, and they really don't belong there. And we see many, many examples on the Forest Service, for instance, where they, with good intentions, brought in seed mixes, and now they've introduced species that really don't belong there. They belong in the Grand Canyon or wherever. And so our idea from the beginning was that we want to establish the seeds, the species that are from the local area. Okay? And so we resisted planting anything except the tree species in Ocotillo, and everything else came in from blow-in seed from adjacent deserts and from the seed that was in the soil itself. Okay? And with that, today we have 108 different native species. 21 of those 108 species are grass species. It's remarkable the diversity of native grass species we have out there. The 3 woodies that we planted were Whitethorn Acacia, Foothills Palo Verde, and Ironwood. Why did we plant those? Well, we just walked over to adjacent deserts and saw what was growing out there. And basically the default woodies were these 3 species. And so that's what we planted, and that's what we got. Whitethorn Acacia, Acacia or Vachellia constricta, grows very well and is found in wetter places in the desert, but we found that it makes a remarkable restoration plant, even in the dry areas. And it comes up readily and it grows readily. Over time, the Foothills Palo Verdes and the Ironwoods will come in and take over. But as far as establishing plants and good woody plants, this is quite remarkable. And we've been very, very happy with it. Foothills Palo Verde is the default Palo Verde of the Sonora Desert. This is the silent partner of saguaros. Wherever saguaros grow, Foothills Palo Verde grows. They go hand in hand. Everybody pays attention to saguaros. They're so iconic. They're so photogenic. Nobody, for the most part, pays attention to Palo Verde. But the fact of the matter is, they're out there and they go together. And Palo Verde, Foothills Palo Verde is the main nurse tree of saguaros. Okay? There's a big difference between Foothills Palo Verde and blue Palo Verde. Foothills Palo Verde grows in the very droughty areas where saguaros grow. Blue Palo Verdes have evolved in arroyos and washes, and they need wet feet. Totally different. We get blue Palo Verdes coming in on mining trucks, you know, that bring them in as weeds, but we take them out as soon as we see them. Foothills Palo Verde is what we want. Why? Foothills Palo Verdes have multiple trunks, and they readily shed their leaves and their stems, and they make lots and lots of mulch underneath the canopy. And they have a big spreading canopy. This is a perfect habitat for young succulents to grow in. Come out to the restoration site and we'll show you. Ironwood, of course, this is why we have Ironwood Forest National Monument. Ironwood is a remarkable tree that we now know regularly grows to be 800 years old, significantly older than any of the saguaros. And it is tough, and it can handle droughts and it can handle mega droughts. And now we've seen instances of the recent, following the recent mega drought, that we're finding even Palo Verdes, Foothills Palo Verdes that have succumbed to the drought, and the ironwoods have just come up and laughed their way up. One thing that we've discovered in our work is that when we do get cattle that come onto the site, the cattle can take a Palo Verde this high in times of drought and munch it down and bonsai it. Ironwood have lots of little thorns along the branches, even a young plant, and the cows put their mouth around that and try to munch it, and they don't like it. They pull away. We have never seen a ruminant, much less cattle, or even any animal eat on the ironwood. Whereas on the Palo Verde, we see that quite often. Okay, we have 3 species that we'd like to highlight tonight that are succession species. Fluff grass is probably the littlest, the smallest grass in the Sonora Desert, but the most common and probably the most overlooked. This grass comes in every place in the Sonora Desert, wherever there is disturbed soil. And all around Tucson, it's coming up, and you're walking on it. People just don't notice it. But it's just a small plant. It's a small grass that grows at most 2.5 inches high. And it comes up during the monsoon season in abundance. And you can see in this picture, this was early on in the restoration. And as you look down the site, look at the backlit plants, those are fluff grass plants. And fluff grass plants come up. And if it's a real wet year, they'll form stolons, little runners, and they'll form other little plantlets, and they'll come in and sink their little roots down. They'll live for a maximum of 2 years and then gracefully die. And if you look at this picture, you'll see the carcasses of fluff grass from previous years. Not paying attention. You see the carcasses from the previous years. Those skeletons catch seed of other native plants that are flying around. And then those skeletons serve as mulch for the growth of these native plants. And we see this over and over again. And unless you're paying attention, you're oblivious to this. But we see this, and it's like a symphony every year. The second succession hero is trailing 4 o'clock, Allionia incarnata. And this is a 4 o'clock. It's an annual, and it comes in and can germinate any month of the year if there's a little bit of moisture and if it's warm enough. And it comes up, and if it's a dry year, it'll make its pretty little pink flower and go to seed. If it's a wet year, look at the flowers. Isn't that gorgeous? It's also called desert windmills. But if it's a wet year, it'll send out runners. And these runners can be up to 15, 20 feet long. And along the runners, it'll have flowers. And in a wet year, and if you catch it at the right time, it'll look like a carpet of blooms. It's quite beautiful. And it also gracefully dies. And what does it leave? It leaves all of these stems on the ground that cover the ground. Okay, so the desert may be bare, but it's bare with useful material on the ground. And this provides shade, and you get a little bit of a rain, even a tenth of an inch. And under that shade, you get the retention of moisture and young plants that come up. And we see winter annuals and summer annuals coming up under the mulch of trailing 4 o'clock. And the third succession hero, there are lots of them, but I just want to point 3 of them out, is Mexican panicgrass, Panicum hirticale. And this is another little annual that comes up, and it's quite common, but usually overlooked. And we spray buffelgrass in a lot of different places, A Mountain, the Catalinas, and different desert peaks on Ironwood Forest National Monument, and even on roadsides and trail sides. Every place we have sprayed buffelgrass, this is a follower. This is a camp follower that comes in. It seems to fit wherever buffelgrass fits, but it's a native. And it comes in, especially in a year like this year when we have the late rains in the month of September up on A Mountain. A Mountain is just abounding in Mexican panicgrass right now. And so is the Waterman site, because we've had these late rains in the month of September, and we've taken out the buffelgrass, and it's just loving it. Okay, this isn't a succession plant, but this is a climax plant. And everybody, their eyes go to the big plants, the saguaros, the ironwood trees, the big Palo Verdes. But if you let your eyes go down on the ground, one of the most common plants in the Sonora Desert are the bursages, triangle leaf bursage and white bursage. And these are bursages that grow maybe 3 feet high, and they spread out, and they can have a canopy of maybe 3 or 4 feet. And they live to be 70 to 80 years old. And they are drought deciduous. So if it's dry, like dry times of the year, they'll drop its leaves. And if it's real dry, it'll drop its stems. And it does this over 10, 20, 30 years, and it builds up mulch underneath the plants. And this mulch softens the soil. And you get rodents that come in and start digging underneath the bursage. And what does that do? It opens up the desert to bringing in the rain, soaking in the rain. These are absolutely critical for natural water harvesting in the desert. In healthy deserts where we see large populations of triangle leaf bursage, you do not have soil erosion. And so we are encouraging as much as possible this species coming in, and it is. And what's really exciting is that we have brittle bush out there, and brittle bush comes in right away after disturbance. But brittle bush has a taproot, okay, and a few side roots off of the taproots. But the triangle leaf bursage has a fibrous root system, which is very efficient in taking up the water. And what happens, and we're seeing it over and over again, little bursages are growing next to brittle bush, and the bursages underground are basically mopping up the moisture from underneath the bursages. And from year after year, we're seeing that the bursage gets bigger and bigger, and the brittle bush gets smaller and smaller. So we have plant succession going on right before our eyes. And if you come out and visit next week, maybe next Saturday, you can see it. And finally, we have another climax plant that we tried to plant from seed. We got special permission from the BLM to harvest saguaros on ironwood. Normally, it's only Native Americans that are allowed to harvest saguaros on public lands, but we got special permission to do that so that we could plant them on the site. We harvested them over 6 years and we planted them for 6 years. And so far we have 1 saguaro. Tell me why. I don't know, but that's been our track record. But what we do have are lots of nurse trees. We have lots of Palo Verdes and ironwoods that are this high. And so we signed an agreement with Tucson Cactus and Succulent last year, whereby they will give us, Tucson Cactus and Succulent will give us small saguaros that they rescue from their rescue sites. They, of course, give us the ugly ones, but that's all right. The desert doesn't see ugly. And we have been transplanting them under the nurse plants. And so far we've got 30 of them, and we are taking great care to make sure that what we do transplant is going to grow well and normally into the future. The demonstration garden. We've had the long-term idea to put in a demonstration garden to show the public the desert plants, the species that are the most common out on the site. And our colleague, Dennis LeBlond, who has basically been running all of our water harvest efforts, came up with the idea of building a 100-ton sponge. And basically what this is that it's like a layer cake. The bottom layer is railroad ballast. And these are big jagged rocks that are used underneath railroad causeways. And basically these rocks lock together. They have big interstitial spaces so that when water runs through them, they don't silt up, but water continues to run through them. And so they can hold water. So the bottom layer is 20 tons of railroad ballast. The top layer is desert soil. And we transplanted the woodies in deep pots and watered them for a year. These are the only plants on the whole 18 acres that were ever watered. And then we planted locally collected seed of the desert species, and we have signs. And so basically we never have to water it because this is passively watered from rainfall and rainwater that's running off the slopes. You can dig a hole, put your arm down anytime during the year, and it's going to be moist down below. And so basically water is wicking up, and it works. We also decided from the get-go, we need to document what's happening and document the changes. And so we decided early on to do annual fixed point photography. And we hired a landscape photographer who's done a lot of work up in the Verde River Valley, Jim Cowlin. He lives up in Oracle. And we established 6 fixed points back in 2010, 2011. And pictures are taken every year around the 15th of October at the exact time of the morning for each point. And so for view 1, we take that picture at 7 o'clock, 15th of October. Actually, this morning we took them 13th of October, but that's close enough. And so if you take it at 7 o'clock, the same day every year, the shadows are the same. It's not rocket science, but it works. And so the next picture, view 2, is taken at 7:20, 7:40, 8 o'clock. And we've done this over 11 years, starting in 2011. And see here you have a picture of old Jim out there, focusing his camera, comparing with the views from the previous years. And this is just one of the views, 2011, 2016, 2000, actually 20, this was taken this morning as 22. You can go on our AZNPS website and onto the conservation page, and you can see all 6 views and all 10, 11 years, basically, and if you want to see the progression. It's pretty neat. Okay, the volunteer effort that went into this. There's been over 7,000 hours of volunteer work. Actually, it's much, much more. And through the entire time, we've had a sustained core group of Native Plant Society volunteers. And of course, over the year, and it's been a core group of about 3 to 5 people. And this has been really essential to keep the continuity. But people have aged out, they moved away, that happens over a period of 12 years, but we've kept the core group going. And we've been assisted very consistently by BLM volunteer interns, and these are usually people in their early 20s that have been really quite helpful, but at the same time, they're enthusiastic to learn, and hopefully they've learned a lot. Besides that, we've had 14 Eagle Scout projects, and you get the scouts out there, their big brothers, their parents, and we've gotten a lot done. U of A Student Club, Desert Museum Youth Club, and every year we had an annual work day on the first Saturday of December, getting about 40 to 50 people every year, and we would split into work crews of 6 to 7 people, and that's where we got a lot of our water harvesting structures work done. And on those days, we got considerable help from Arizona Sierra Club. Sandy Barr would come down from Phoenix every year. She's the president of the Arizona Sierra Club, and actually bring lunch for us, and the Friends of Ironwood Forest. And here are just some cameo pictures of this is the volunteer youth group from Desert Museum. There's an Eagle Scout project. Here's the university group. And these are people at the work day discussing the day's work. So now let me mention one thing. People think that to do this kind of work, you need dollars. Well, I think funding is a problem, because funding means that you have to go out and apply for grants. And grants, for the most part, are at the most three years long. This kind of a project you cannot do in 3 years. So you would have to reapply for grants every 3 years, 4 times, and it'd have to be back to back. So we didn't even fool with that. We never went out looking for grants. All of the effort was in kind from BLM, and it was in kind effort from us. Dripping wet, we've had maybe $15,000 over 12 years go through our hands. And that money, $7,000, was used for interpretive signage that you're going to see here in a minute. And then the other was used for renting backhoes and machinery. So I simply would like to point that out, that money can be a hindrance to get things done. And I think we need to get back to the old, volunteer effort and stick-with-itness to get things done, and think about that. So over a period of 12 years, our native plant-led volunteers have managed to transform 18 acres of buffelgrass monoculture to a species-rich landscape well on its way to full recovery as an upland Palo Verde saguaro plant community. This is the only successful saguaro Palo Verde upland landscape restoration of such size in the Sonora Desert. That's a pretty bold statement, but I stand by it. Next Saturday, October 22nd, a special public event will mark the start of this nationally recognized Waterman Restoration interpretive and educational site. And you are all invited, and you can see our webpage for details. Last Friday, the interpretive signs were put up, And these are the two installers, but they're going to be covered up by veils next Saturday, and we will unveil them for the public. Let's remember that the mission of Arizona Native Plant Society is to promote knowledge, appreciation, and conservation and restoration of the Arizona native plants and their habitats. So let's do it. Yeah. Questions?
So folks on the Zoom can feel free to enter questions in the chat. Folks here in person, does anyone have a question right off the bat? Go ahead.
Yes. Speak up.
Minutes early on when you built the site, we're talking about erosion. So were your single rock layers, were they perpendicular to the line?
Yes. Yeah, perpendicular. Yeah, but they would be, depending on the situation, you know, you'd make them maybe 12 to 20 rocks deep. And then you'd have different sizes of rocks as well. Yeah. But you'd have a whole series of them if it was an issue. Yeah. So like on the landing strip, because there's a landing strip out there, believe it or not, 1 kilometer long. We do have the beginning of one ditch down the middle. And there are about 20, a series of about 21 rock dams. And so you end up with, it's almost like terraces that work their way down. Yeah.
The secondarily to that, you mentioned the saguaros from TCSS. Did you not mulch around them to try and trap water?
What we're doing is using a lot of vegetative mulch rather than rocks. Yeah. Because saguaros, you know, as you know, their roots are only about three inches deep. And so you don't want to impede water access, rainwater access coming to the roots. And so vegetative mulch is probably the most effective. Yeah. Yes, Susie. Yeah.
When you mentioned buffelgrass hiding under hiding in the brittle bushes, so when you spray that buffelgrass, does that also kill the brittle bush?
Yes, yes. I mean, but there's a lot of brittle bush out there. Okay, and so you know, you do get some what do you say, collateral damage on the brittle bush, but that is far less of an issue than the issue of letting the buffelgrass go to seed. So, yeah.
Are there herbicides that just kill grass?
There are.
I wondered that before.
There are, yeah. But glyphosate is far more effective than those herbicides. Yes. Oh, go ahead, Susie. You had another question. No, that's right. Creosote, how do I say this? In healthy desert situations, creosote populations are very low. It's kind of like desert broom. You find a plant here and you find a plant there. Creosote, when you have entire fields full of creosote, that is simply an indication that you had overgrazing, severe overgrazing in the past, because the cattle ate out everything except the creosote. And then the creosote is so effective at pumping water out of the soil, it's almost impossible for other plants to get going and take root. And so we have been very careful to avoid bringing in creosote, or if creosote is establishing itself in big numbers, we've been discouraging creosote. Because it's so much more important to get your triangle leaf burr sage going, you know, and your trees, your desert trees going than creosote. Creosote will outcompete these other plants.
So I have some questions from the Zoom here. To begin with, did you try prickly pears and choyas?
Prickly pear and cholla are coming in on their own. And what's really interesting, and basically we're discovering it on the restoration site, but if you go out to the desert, it's the case everywhere, is that deserts are heterogeneous. And so we're finding in our 18 acres, we're not finding a uniform population of prickly pears or choyas coming in. But we're finding some areas that seem to favor the succulents. And so we'll find, especially in the rocky areas, we'll find huge populations of succulents, especially the hedgehog cactus and the mammillarias and the prickly pear, less the choyas.
I have a question here. Given Foothills Palo Verde doesn't require wet feet, how do you plant them? In a berm or just out on the desert?
Well, we plant them by seed. And what we're finding with Foothills Palo Verde, it's appropriately named, that on slopes, we're getting far more success at establishing foothills than on flat land. They really love slopes. And they not only emerge in far greater numbers, but they grow much better than on flat slopes, flat areas. The same goes for saguaros as well. I don't know why.
Does hand pulling buffelgrass work if you only have a small number of plants?
Sure. I mean, but hand pulling, especially following rains, you know, when the ground is soft, that works. But if you're hand pulling when the ground is dry and you break off the stems, you're leaving the growing point, which is the crown. And what does the growing point do? It proliferates next year. And instead of having 2 stems, you have 15 stems, you know, that are vigorous. And so we much prefer to spray the green plants because the herbicide moves down and kills the crowns. And so our kill rate is much higher.
And does the entire project rely on rainwater harvested on site, not any supplemental water?
There is no supplemental, except in the demonstration garden at the beginning. There's been no supplemental water whatever. Yeah.
Well, that's all the questions I have for you. So thank you so much, John, for this presentation. This was fantastic, and I encourage everyone to come to the unveiling on the 22nd. Thank you so much.
I gotta say it, we're getting your talk, the Christian group over here got going. Oh yeah, it's really pumping him up. They're pumping him up with the Jesus music.
Because there were more people, you mean?
No, I was just thinking that as you were getting to the end, they really kicked in, and I was like,
Oh, the questions, yeah.
or the music, yeah.
So the Zoom is off.
I'm finishing the Zoom right now.
Can I pull that out or not?
One sec.
What else do you have about the climate? Getting hotter and hotter?
Before we, can I turn that back on? Still on? And no, the
Oh, the slideshow.
slideshow, yeah. Let's see. I didn't want to put this in the presentation, but I've got slides. The climate, okay. We're getting more and more extreme climate. Okay, it isn't just global warming. And what does extreme climate look like here in Tucson? We're getting bigger rains that are hitting some areas and not others. Okay, on the night of the 10th of September, we had a freak downpour of 3.5 inches on the Waterman side that fell over 2 hours. At the same time that rain was falling, there was a tornado going on up around Regatop, which is just north of us, 20 miles north. And so you had this tornado going on up there. We got 3.5 inches in a short period of time. Barry Stevenson, who's a colleague of ours, 3 miles down to the east of us, got nothing. Okay, so that's what we call extreme weather. And what did that do? Did that. And
That's on the water part.
yes. And it opened up a breach. Basically, it was the first breach we've ever had on this project. And these down cuts go for about 400 yards. Okay. And fortunately, they're on one end. But over the next 4 years, we're going to fix that because you've got to learn how to fix it. And we fixed down cuts like this elsewhere. Okay. But yeah, climate change is going to do some pretty nasty things. And then up in the mountains above us, we saw down cuts suddenly show up in the mountains as well. So, yeah.
So fixing it, gonna be like this.
What's that? No,
We're gonna fix it, so.
we've got experience from another area. And believe it or not, what we've been doing is taking tree trunks, entire trees, okay? And you lay them in here. It takes them uphill. And you stack them like this. And so if you can imagine, trees stack one after another. I'm glad you tried this. But what happens is that when the water comes down, it brings silt and it silts that up. And it's much more effective in healing your deep cuts than rock cuts. But I'll tell you, these kind of things are going to drain our deserts, and you know, we call them deserts, but we haven't seen anything yet until we get down cuts like this, because they're going to pull all the moisture out of our cuts if we let them go. Yeah. It's like that. Yep.